They say numbers don't lie. But what if I told you, one girl used numbers to see death before it happened, to expose betrayals before they occurred, to unravel secrets not even their owners remembered burying? In the spring of 1871, in a narrow, soot-lined alley of Pittsburgh's immigrant quarter, an 11-year-old girl named Clara Weiss whispered a sentence that would haunt a physician to his deathbed. "I wouldn't enter your clinic tomorrow," she said, eyes like gray ice. "The man in the red scarf will be waiting." The man in question was Ernst Halber, a rival doctor who had just returned from Vienna and held a violent grudge. The next morning, a pistol discharged in the clinic's front room. No one saw Clara that day, but the rumors, they grew teeth. This isn't folklore. Clara Weiss was documented, barely, removed from every institutional record by the time she turned 12. Why? Because Clara didn't guess. She calculated. She watched, remembered, and recorded every breath, every gesture, every crack in a man's tone. Then she predicted behavior so accurately, it unstitched the fabric of secrecy entire communities were sewn together by. What began as a curiosity became a weapon. Her mind, patterned like a machine, her expressions detached, could dissect the psychology of anyone she observed, not with malice but with clinical clarity. And in a world built on lies, clarity was a threat. You were never meant to hear about Clara Weiss. She was an institutional problem, not a medical mystery, but a liability to those in power. Because when one girl can predict betrayal, exposure, or collapse before it happens, the control systems break. People panic, institutions retaliate. Over the next 27 sections, I will show you how this child dismantled the illusions of an entire neighborhood, and what was done to silence her. But know this now, Clara Weiss is not a ghost story. She is a mirror, held up to the system that rules over you. And once you see what she saw, you won't unsee it. Stay until the end, because this descent isn't entertainment, it's initiation into a truth that was buried alive. The year was 1871, and Pittsburgh's Hill District pulsed with the heartbeat of steel. Immigrants from Germany, Poland, and Bohemia crammed into narrow, soot-choked houses. Smokestacks towered over lives built on backbreaking labor, while the iron elite dined behind stained glass and silence. And somewhere in that fractured order, between the scream of furnaces and the scrape of factory boots, Clara Weiss watched. Her parents, Jacob and Lisel, had fled Saxony in 1866 after Jacob was accused of seditious mathematics. What that meant, no one in Pittsburgh understood. But Clara, she inherited whatever it was. By age 6, Clara could read in 4 languages. By 8, she had mapped the sleep cycles, moods, and economic rhythms of every house on their block, documented, cross-referenced, and scored against lunar phases and factory shifts. And no one noticed. Until the deaths began. It started with Herr Vogel, a machinist, found hanging in his shed after Clara informed him quietly, "Your wife's letters stopped being genuine 16 days ago. She has rewritten the same phrase 3 times, but in different ink. Why pretend you don't know?" Vogel's suicide note blamed a black whisper in the walls, but some say it was the pale girl with ink-stained fingers who undid him. Then came the fire at the Braith Mill. Clara told the foreman 2 days prior, "If you remove the night shift again, the fuse box will reach critical failure in 36 hours. The brass screw has been over-tightened." The fire took 5 men. The foreman drank himself into silence, but here's what no one wants to talk about. Clara never gloated. She never boasted. She simply watched, calculated, and warned, coldly, mechanically, as if the collapse of a man's life was as simple as a miscalculated ledger. Dr. Edelstein, the physician who first examined her, wrote in his personal journal, not the official medical file, that Clara's abilities approached the sacrilegious. As if the child bypasses the conscience to access a higher order of understanding, like something divine or profane, pretending to be a girl. That entry was removed. The journal later found in a trunk, beneath a floorboard, hidden with scraps of hair, ink bottles, and something worse, diagrams of the human body, with notes. She was watching more than behaviors. She was modeling how the mind collapses under truth. You're not just hearing a story, you're stepping into the operating room. Let me take you further. It was the spring thaw of 1871 when Clara's silence became a weapon. Her parents, still believing their daughter's mind was a curiosity, not a crisis, took her to Sunday Mass at St. Anthony's. The congregation was thick with German steel workers and their families, their faith a fragile shield against the filth and fear of industrial life. Clara sat in the pew, expressionless. She did not sing, she did not blink, she watched. After the service, Father Kunz, a barrel-chested priest with a fondness for schnapps and secrets, leaned down to offer her a blessing. He froze when Clara whispered, "Your confessional sessions on Thursdays end 43 minutes later than other days. Mrs. Ehrlich's perfume remains in the booth each week. Would you like me to calculate the risk of exposure based on her husband's drinking patterns?" The priest staggered back as if slapped. 2 days later, he delivered a fire and brimstone sermon about the devil's arithmetic and children who mimic angels but speak with the tongue of the serpent. He never mentioned Clara by name. He didn't need to. The neighborhood shifted after that. People began crossing the street when they saw her. Mothers gripped their children tighter. Rumors moved like smoke, too thin to catch, too thick to ignore. And Clara, she doubled down. She began carving marks into the wooden frame of her window. Each symbol corresponded to a number, each number to a pattern: theft, infidelity, violence, illness. She didn't predict them. She documented them before they happened. The Weiss home became a shrine to unspoken truths. Jakob, her father, tried to hide the carvings, tried to burn her journals, but Clara only smiled and began etching equations into the soot on the fireplace bricks. "Truth," she said once, "will always right itself." By late May, 3 households had been torn apart, one man imprisoned for crimes no one could prove he committed, except Clara had written his name and the word collision 3 days before his wife was found unconscious near the train depot. The community didn't know whether to fear Clara or fear what else she saw. And here's the question most men will never ask because it terrifies them. What if someone could see through you, down to the fracture line in your soul? What if they knew what you hadn't even admitted to yourself? That was Clara Weiss. Not gifted, not cursed, but aware. And awareness is the most dangerous contagion of all. In June of 1871, Dr. Friedrich Krauss, the most respected mind at Mercy Asylum, was summoned quietly to the Weiss home. He arrived not with instruments but with caution. Word had reached him through hushed corridors of a girl, not possessed, not insane, but precisely aware in ways that unnerved the clergy and confused the medical men. Clara greeted him at the door. "You are not here to help me," she said flatly. "You are here to see if what I know threatens what you believe." Krauss froze. Inside, Jacob tried to explain Clara's episodes as mathematical. She doesn't see ghosts. She sees patterns, behavior, timing, probability. She watches like a machine. But Krauss wasn't listening to the father. His eyes stayed on the daughter, who had already pulled out a notebook. In it, she had documented Krauss's own routines: when he arrived at the clinic each day, when he took morphine for his injured shoulder, how many times he had visited the widow Hertzberg at night since his wife's death. Clara read it aloud like scripture. No tremble, no malice, just numbers. Krauss turned pale. He left 15 minutes later, shaken, refusing payment. That night he filed a private report, not in the asylum's archives, but in a sealed envelope to a colleague in New York. In it he wrote, "This girl is not mad. She is anomaly incarnate. She applies pure logic to human contradiction. She dissects sin with numbers. If this ability spreads, if others learn to see the way she sees, it will unmake the illusions we rely on. But the systems that depend on illusion, religion, medicine, politics, don't tolerate disruption, especially not from an 11-year-old girl born in poverty." Within 2 weeks, officials from the Orphan Inquiry Bureau appeared at the Weiss home. Their claim: educational neglect. It was a lie. Clara read at a doctoral level, but they didn't come for education. They came for containment. The state wanted her removed, quietly. She was too perceptive, too precise, too dangerous, not to others, but to the machinery of secrecy. What happened next was not a rescue. It was an abduction by another name, because institutions don't fear evil, they fear exposure. And Clara Weiss had begun to see too much. They came at dawn. 2 men in black coats, one with a badge from the bureau, the other with hands that looked more accustomed to choking than writing. They didn't knock, they announced, and Clara was ready. She stood at the top of the stairs, holding her leather-bound journal. her gray eyes fixed on the taller man's pocket. "Your service weapon is misaligned," she said. "Left shoulder holster. Weight distribution suggests your draw is slow. You were not sent to reason." The man flinched. Jacob pleaded. Liesel wept, but their words dissolved against the cold certainty of the state. The paperwork had been signed the night before, a complaint filed, a magistrate paid, and a removal order rubber-stamped without review. "Clara Weiss is to be remanded into educational custody," they recited. But the files never said where. And Clara, without resistance, handed her journal to her mother and whispered, "Hide this. If they take the numbers, they take everything." She left the house without a sound, but not before turning to Jacob and saying, 17 days, the man with the scar on his right eye will return for you. Do not open the door." 17 days later, Jacob Weiss would disappear, but we're not there yet. They took Clara to a facility posing as a boarding school, Westmore Institute. Perched on a bluff above the Monongahela River, the stone building reeked of mold and false charity. Its true purpose was never education. Westmore specialized in containment. It housed girls who knew too much, spoke too sharply, calculated too quickly, each one labeled unstable, each one slowly broken, except Clara. She didn't resist the regime. She absorbed it, memorized it, every hallway, every schedule, every crack in the nurse's voice before sedation. She began mapping the rotations of guards, predicting visits, recording who cried in their sleep and who only pretend. And within weeks, she was carving numbers into her bedpost. Within months, the other girls stopped speaking her name aloud, because Clara wasn't just surviving. She was watching the system from within, and when a system is being watched, it begins to break. Let me be clear, this wasn't just one girl in one institution. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous, awareness that could not be contained. At Westmore Institute, Clara Weiss became the ghost in the system. The staff called her compliant. The files said unremarkable. But behind her silence, behind her pale, expressionless face, Clara was documenting everything and everyone. She'd carved over 4,000 data points into the underside of her mattress frame by her 3rd month. She recorded when Nurse Ellie skipped doses, when Dr. Halworth's right eye twitched before sedations, when the girls in cell block C stopped singing, always a precursor to disappearance within 48 hours. She calculated the probability of psychological collapse in each dormitory based on sleep disruption, ambient temperature, and food ration irregularities. She didn't guess, she measured, and by October she no longer needed to write things down. She remembered it all. Then came the night of the clockwork incident. A staff member named Morris, a former asylum warden with a taste for power, approached Clara in the hallway. He spoke to her like an object. "You see everything, don't you, girl?" Clara looked up. "Yes, including what you did to patient 12. Morris froze. That patient had vanished a week earlier, officially transferred. Unofficially, screaming, drugged, dragged. Clara continued. "You covered the bloodstain in cell 2 with new floor varnish, but the pattern of absorption was uneven. You used bleach first, but the chemical left a trail." Morris grabbed her by the collar. "You think you're smart, don't you? Think you know how this place works?" Clara leaned forward and whispered, "I know how you work. Your patterns collapse under pressure. Your father's death taught you to punish weakness. You have 10 days before your outburst triggers a formal review." He slapped her. She didn't flinch. The next morning, Morris filed for early retirement. 10 days later, he was gone. Clara's calculations weren't just predictions anymore. They were executions. Not of people, but of control systems. She had no army, no weapons, just a mind so precise it dismantled hierarchy with logic alone. Westmore tried to isolate her further, more sedation, more surveillance. But Clara only smiled. The more they restricted her, the clearer the patterns became. She had seen through their system, now she was inside it. And once inside, Clara Weiss did what no other child in that institution had ever done. She began to change it, not with rebellion, with truth, sharp, surgical, and unstoppable. The first real fracture came in late November of 1871. A girl named Ruth Branner, silent since her arrival, began speaking again, not randomly, not emotionally. She spoke in codes, patterns, quiet recitations of times, names, floor changes. They were Clara's patterns, passed in glances, in chalk marks under beds, in strings of thread tied between bedposts. Westmore hadn't just imprisoned Clara, They'd unintentionally created a signal tower. Clara had begun transmitting logic like a contagion, and the girls, previously labeled unstable, hysterical, or incurable, were beginning to wake up. Not to freedom, but to structure. They stopped reacting. They started watching. The staff noticed the silence first. No more crying at night, no more outbursts, just stillness, calculation. The girls began lining up early, eating precisely, memorizing every detail of the guards' shifts. One nurse confided, "It feels like they know something we don't." They did, because Clara had taught them that the system wasn't omnipotent. It was predictable, and predictability could be defeated not with violence, but with precision. Then came the night of the light failure. For 12 minutes, the entire West Wing went dark. A candle dropped. The fuse box failed. The backup oil lanterns had been emptied the day before, by someone. In those 12 minutes, 5 girls swapped rooms, 3 forged staff documents, 1 placed a folded note beneath the administrator's desk. "Your brother didn't die of fever. Check the pharmacy ledger." When light returned, everything looked normal, but the system had been inverted. Westmore's control had been breached, not with force but understanding. Clara never left her cell that night. She didn't have to, because influence doesn't require presence, it requires clarity, and Clara's clarity had become weaponized. The staff responded with lockdowns, full sedation schedules, food restrictions, isolation chambers. But it didn't matter. Clara had passed the point of physical resistance. She had created a network of mental escape. Westmore thought it was running a facility, but what it had created was an awakening, and awakening spreads, especially when it's born from truth, especially when it has nothing left to lose. By December, the board of Westmore Institute initiated an internal review. Unusual behavior patterns had been flagged in Dormitory 3. Staff resignations were rising. 3 nurses requested reassignment to distant institutions. 1 claimed the girls were sharing dreams, but the administrators didn't understand. This wasn't mass hysteria, it was mass precision. Clara Weiss had reconstructed reality for these girls, inside their minds. She taught them that control depended on one thing, ignorance of the system. And once they saw the system clearly, they could slip through it, one silent move at a time. It wasn't dramatic. There were no riots, no locked doors smashed, just small surgical shifts in behavior that dismantled the machine. A girl named Edith began coughing precisely when Nurse Ellie entered with the sedation cart, always loud enough to cover the sound of a pill being slipped beneath the tongue instead of swallowed. Another, Miriam, began writing letters in invisible ink made from diluted soap and chalk. Each one passed between laundry baskets, never intercepted, and Ruth, the one who'd been mute for months, began drawing spirals on the walls. Not art, not madness, but spiral graphs, mapping the movement of every staff member between noon and dusk. The staff wrote it off as insanity, but Clara knew better. The spiral is the most efficient shape in nature for growth and movement. It was her way of saying, "We are evolving." They tried to remove her. The Institute's director, pressured by higher powers, signed an order to have Clara transferred to St. Bellamy Asylum for incurables. The carriage arrived, but Clara was gone. Her bed empty, no footprints, only one thing left. A drawing, charcoal, on the stone wall. A map of Westmore, detailed down to every corridor, door, shadow, and weak point in its foundation. At the bottom, in perfect ski, script, "If you know the system's rhythm, you don't escape, you dissolve into it." They searched for weeks, questioned every girl. No one spoke. Because Clara Weiss hadn't escaped Westmore, she had become its ghost, and the Institute would never recover. It was 2 weeks after Clara's disappearance when the first incident occurred. A guard named Lowell collapsed mid-shift. No visible injury, no signs of illness, just unconscious. In his pocket, a folded note, 6 digits, perfectly aligned. Below them the phrase, "This is how long you watched and did nothing." Lowell never returned. Then came the fire in the records room. Not an accident. Every file containing the names of the girls from Dormitory 3 gone. Burned with surgical precision, no structural damage, no trail. Just absence, a targeted erasure. It was as if Clara hadn't just escaped, She was removing the evidence of her existence, like a phantom rewriting history. The staff grew paranoid. Rooms were checked hourly. Guards doubled, hallways repainted, mirrors removed, journals confiscated, but nothing stopped the strange new order forming inside Westmore. The girls were no longer trembling. They were waiting for something. A quiet pulse ran through their behavior, synchronized and unspoken, like the beat of a clock ticking beneath the floorboards. Every movement aligned, every whisper calculated. The doctors tried to reassert control with harsh measures, cold water submersions, heavy sedation, isolation chambers. But the more they pushed, the less they understood what they were fighting. This wasn't rebellion, it was a reprogramming. One of the nurses cracked. She fled the building mid-storm, soaked and barefoot, screaming, "They don't blink anymore. They look through you." She wasn't wrong. Clara had altered something fundamental in the way these girls perceived. They weren't children anymore. They were observers, unblinking, silent, and tracking everything, and it wasn't just inside the walls. A week later, the Westmore director opened a parcel delivered to his estate. Inside, a photograph of him from behind. Standing in his study at 2:47 a.m. holding a brandy glass, alone. Except he hadn't been alone. The photo was taken from the garden. No footsteps in the snow, no sign of entry, no signature, just a handwritten note. Clarity reaches farther than locks ever will. They thought Clara Weiss was a ghost, but ghosts don't leave fingerprints. Clara left warnings. By January 1872, Westmore Institute was no longer functioning as a hospital. It was something else, something colder, quieter, like a theater after the final act, where no one leaves their seat. Because something had changed inside those walls. It wasn't just that Clara had vanished, it was that her perception remained. Her mind, mechanical, exacting, pattern-driven, had infected the institution like code slipping through a firewall. The girls no longer behaved like patients, they behaved like analysts, recorders of detail, students of deception, and the staff began to fracture. Nurse Ellie stopped sleeping. She was found one night scrubbing the hallway with bleach long after shift change, muttering, "They see us, all of us, like we're glass." Dr. Felser resigned. His final report contained 37 pages of erratic notes, including one line repeated over and over. "The Institute has reversed. We are the subjects now." But the strangest transformation was spatial. Rooms felt rearranged, not physically, but psychologically. Orderlies claimed doors were opening into different hallways than before. A maintenance man found himself on the 4th floor when he was sure he'd taken stairs to the 2nd. There was no 4th floor. The blueprints no longer matched the building, but when checked, nothing had changed, visibly. Something deeper had. Because Clara hadn't escaped Westmore in body, she had rewired it, like a language or a system of thought. And now the building responded to that system, not for everyone, only those who had seen the patterns, those who had received the transmission. Late one night, a visiting board member requested to interview a girl from Dormitory 3, just to see what the fuss was about. He never left the room. He was found the next morning, sitting upright, eyes open, catatonic. No injuries, no trauma, just silence, clenched in his fist, a slip of paper. It is not madness to see what others deny. It is madness to ignore the rhythm beneath everything. They transferred him to Bellamy, same place they meant to send Clara. Only Clara had never gone. She had sent them there instead. Outside Westmore, whispers began to leak. Not from newspapers, not from officials, from families. Parents of the girls in Dormitory 3, those who hadn't vanished, fled, or silenced themselves, began receiving letters. Unsigned, no return address, but unmistakable in tone. Each one described truths their daughters could not have known. An affair hidden for decades, a missing brother buried under another name, a bribe paid in 1867 to cover up a stillborn birth that wasn't actually still. Every letter contained data, observations, dates, names, motives, not curses, not threats, clarity. As if the girls, through Clara's lens, had begun to map human deception the way a surveyor maps land. And the strange thing, most recipients didn't reject the letters. They folded them, hid them, reread them in silence. Because deep down, they knew. Clara had uncovered something precise, not supernatural, structural. A system of lies that binds society together, and how easily that system could unravel under one mind devoted to truth without fear, without flinching, and without apology. Inside the institute, the girls had changed their schedule without asking. Wake at 4:17 a.m., cold compresses at 5:02, mirror gazing in silence for exactly 47 seconds, writing with the non-dominant hand until breakfast. When asked why, one girl answered, "Because this is when the noise quiets." "What noise?" Another whispered, "The noise you mistake for your own thoughts." The staff didn't understand, but Dr. Renly, the last psychologist still assigned to Dormitory 3, started having dreams, always the same. Clara standing at the edge of his bed, not speaking, just watching. Sometimes she would hold a mirror, other times a metronome. Tick, 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 until he'd wake up drenched, heart racing, uncertain if the sound was real. On his final day at Westmore, he wrote a single sentence on his resignation form. She didn't vanish, she inverted the institution around herself. Because Clara Weiss wasn't trying to escape the system, she was showing the rest of us how it works. There was a corridor at Westmore no one ever used. East Wing, behind the linen storage, sealed in 1869 after a patient collapse. Or so they said. But on February 19, 1872, 3 months after Clara's disappearance, it was found open. Not broken into, not forced, just open. Inside, 13 mattresses neatly laid out, a single wooden chair, and on the walls, writing, not scrawled, not manic, measured, mathematical, as if Clara had dictated it through someone else's hand. Lines of sequences, ratios between breath intervals, eye blink synchronization patterns, mentions of mirror inversion states and social opacity thresholds, and in the center, a circle drawn in white ash surrounding the words, "The eye does not belong to the face." They shut the corridor again, boarded it, painted over it, but it was too late. Because Westmore wasn't haunted by Clara, it was evolving under her algorithm. That spring, 5 girls from Dormitory 3 were declared mentally unfit for reintegration. But they weren't unstable, they were too calm, too exact, as if they no longer operated on the same psychological model as the rest of us. One girl, 13-year-old Johanna, told her interviewer, "When Clara looked at us, she didn't see children, she saw keys." To what? Doors no one else wanted to admit existed. Meanwhile, in nearby villages, strange events began. Dogs would sit outside certain homes and howl for hours, only those whose residents had been on Westmore's funding board. A local physician was found sketching spirals obsessively in the margins of his patient files. He claimed they were coordinates. To where? He didn't know, but he had seen them before. In Clara's eyes, the day he tried to examine her and forgot how to speak for nearly 2 minutes. Westmore was no longer a facility, it had become a vessel, a medium. And Clara? She wasn't inside it anymore. She was beneath it, not physically, structurally. Her thinking had taken root like a language that teaches itself, mutates, and then speaks back to the world. And once you heard it, you could never unhear it again. By midsummer of 1872, the Institute had stopped admitting new patients. Officially, it was due to structural maintenance. But that was a lie. The truth was whispered by the groundskeepers, overheard by passing clergy, hinted at in letters from nurses who fled in the night. Westmore wasn't safe, not for the staff, not for the public, not even for reality itself. Something had opened, something that thought, not like a ghost, not like a god, but like a machine that studies your reactions and adapts. One of the last nurses on rotation, Alice Feldman, left behind a journal. Its pages were later confiscated, but one passage remained, copied by hand before the burn order. Clara has become a geometry. She is not a presence but an angle. If you stand at the wrong position, the room stops behaving. Time bends, memory shortens, language loops. You start to feel like a copy of someone else's thought. This wasn't madness. This was architecture, infected. And those closest to her, especially the girls, had become translators. The way their heads tilted in sync during questions, the way they blinked in alternating patterns, the way one would pause mid-sentence and the other would finish her thought word for word. When interviewed separately, the girls repeated the same phrase in different tones. Do not treat perception as permission. She sees you seeing her. There were reports of mirrors fogging when no one was in the room, of clocks skipping seconds, never backward, only forward, like time was being edited. One evening, a janitor found an entire hallway humming, not with sound, but with a frequency that made his teeth ache, his balance waver, and his speech blur. He left Westmore the next day and was never seen again, but before he vanished, he left a message scratched into the Institute's garden wall. She is not a girl, she is a protocol, and she is still running. Whatever Clara Weiss had become, she was no longer missing. She was replicating. By autumn, the government stepped in. Not the local constables, not the mayor. This came from above, men in black coats with no insignia, no documentation, only orders. They arrived in silence and spoke only to Westmore's inner board. Within 72 hours, all files on Dormitory 3 were sealed. Every photograph, every letter, every medical chart. Burned. Not archived. Burned. And yet, weeks later, fragments began showing up in places no one could explain. A torn page from Clara's intake records, mailed anonymously to a historian in Frankfurt. A photograph of the girls in perfect formation slipped between the pages of a school Bible in Savannah, Georgia. A mirror fragment etched with unfamiliar symbols, discovered inside the wall of a chapel during restoration in Prague. Clara had never left the institution, but her pattern had. She wasn't trying to escape, she was embedding herself, like code. The men in black coats called it a containment breach, though no disease had ever spread this way before. Because this wasn't viral, it was cognitive. An idea so precise, so destabilizing, that even glimpsing it rearranged the way your mind structured reality. A visitor from the Bureau of Mental Sciences, Dr. Lionel Grigg, spent just 2 hours inside Westmore. He emerged mute. 6 months later, he painted a mural on the walls of his home in absolute silence. It showed Clara standing inside a clock, her fingers pointing to 13. He never spoke again, but every night his wife reported he would scratch symbols into the bedsheets as he slept. Always the same ones. 3 interlocking eyes, a spiral, and the phrase, "You are not watching, you are being shown." That phrase would later appear verbatim in the diary of a 9-year-old girl in Denmark. She had never heard of Clara, never visited Westmore, but when asked where she learned those words, she simply say, "Id, in the mirror." By now, one thing was clear: Clara hadn't been studying science, she had been rewriting it. In December of 1872, snow blanketed the grounds of Westmore. The staff, what remained of them, were instructed to vacate within 24 hours. Those who hesitated, those who asked questions, didn't come home. One night, 6 orderlies disappeared. Their uniforms were found folded on their beds, their boots arranged neatly beneath. No sign of struggle, no footprints in the snow. Only a single word burned into the wood of the hallway: impression. No one knew what it meant, but in Clara's early drawings, preserved only through smuggled sketches, she used that word often, not as a metaphor, as a mechanism. She wrote, "Memory is an impression left by repetition. But what if the repetition comes from somewhere else? Not our minds, but the design behind them." By January, the East Wing, the one sealed since 1869, began to change. Floorboards warped without moisture, wall angles no longer obeyed geometry, rooms became larger inside than outside. Surveyors refused to enter, one fainted after just 30 seconds inside. He later claimed there were too many corners, but not enough space. A physicist from Vienna was called in under false pretenses. He lasted a full hour inside the East Wing, then walked calmly to the nearby woods and hanged himself using his own measuring tape. His final note read, "It is not madness, it is precision beyond comprehension." And yet Westmore's board still insisted on closure. They wanted the building demolished. But every time workers arrived, something went wrong. Tools vanished. Schematics redrew themselves. One foreman broke his own hand with a hammer, screaming, "She won't let us forget." At last the project was abandoned, fences erected, access denied. But they didn't know. The building was no longer the danger, it was the echo. Clara's pattern had gone beyond walls, beyond people. It now lived in stories. In dreams, in the structure of questions that should not be asked, because to ask them is to bring her closer, and she is always listening. February 1873. Westmore Institute stood silent. Snow swallowed the grounds. Windows stared blankly, like eyes too long open. The gates, once rusted shut, now hung loose, as if inviting something in. But by then, it was already inside us. In the cities nearby, reports of identical dreams surged. Children waking up screaming of a woman with no mouth speaking from the ceiling. Elderly patients drawing impossible blueprints in their sleep. A priest in Manchester collapsed mid-sermon after shouting a phrase never heard before. We are living in a failed translation. What had Clara built? Not a cult, not a religion, not even a rebellion. She had discovered a bridge between perception and design. A way to reverse-engineer the systems that governed thought, memory, even time itself, and she taught it to children. One telegram from a former Westmore nurse, sent to a doctor in Vienna and later intercepted, read, she called it mirroring, said the world wasn't real unless it was observed, but not just by us, by it. And she found a way to turn the observation back on the observer. They shut down the telegraph office that same night. The doctor was never heard from again, but his notes remained. One sentence circled in red, this is not psychiatry, this is physics with teeth. Meanwhile, in a basement archive beneath the Ministry of Health, an old phonograph was found playing on a loop, though no one had wound it. A child's voice spoke slowly, in perfect German. You believe the mind is protected because it is private. But Clara proved, privacy is just a rhythm that hasn't yet been broken. The recording was destroyed, the archivists reassigned. But weeks later, similar audio patterns were found embedded in wax cylinders in 3 other countries. None of them had ever heard of Westmore. Yet each bore Clara's signature phrase, etched faintly on the rim. Why? Our silence is the invitation. This was no longer about her disappearance, this was about her survival strategy. Because Clara Weiss didn't die. She decentralized, she became a format, and the more we speak her name, the more the format replicates. By spring of 1873, those who had once dismissed Clara as a medical anomaly began to vanish from the record. Professors, surgeons, archivists, not murdered, not exiled, erased. Their academic papers no longer cited, their portraits missing from gallery walls, even their family members claimed to have never known anyone by that name. It was as if Clara had rewritten history's memory, and in a sense, she had, because Westmore's collapse wasn't physical, it was temporal. Events began appearing out of order, letters dated before their authors were born, newspaper clippings describing incidents that hadn't yet occurred, even gravestones with death dates still years away. One such marker read, Clara Weiss, 1873, no death date, just a blank space, and beneath that, in lettering unlike anything carved before or since, the first to unsee the page. That phrase sent linguists into chaos. It broke grammatical logic. Because how do you unsee a page that hasn't been written yet, unless you're the one writing it? A quiet theory began to form in underground circles that Clara was not a subject of study, but a participant in the architecture of awareness itself. Not just bending perception, but entering the mechanism that writes it. She didn't want to be remembered. She wanted to be embedded, not a memory, a function. It's no coincidence that around this time, a new psychological disorder was recorded across Europe. Chronodissonance syndrome. Patients claimed they could feel events happening in the wrong order, before birth, after death, or across others' memories. Many drew the same symbol in chalk on floors and walls. 3 concentric circles, each folding inward. In the center, a single dot, representing, they claimed, the witness. No one knew what it meant, but a child in Amsterdam, only 5 years old, was caught whispering the same phrase in her sleep. She's not a ghost, she's the glitch you invited in. No one had told her about Clara. She just knew. Because that's how formats work. You don't learn them, you inherit them. By the summer of 1873, something had shifted beneath Europe's skin. Not visibly, not loudly, but systemically. Clocks began falling out of sync, by minutes, then hours. Train schedules failed, not from human error, but from something deeper. Time itself no longer held steady. In a hidden wing of the Swiss Academy, scholars met in secret to review a forbidden hypothesis. It came from the notes of a vanished engineer, last employed by Westmore before its closure. He'd written, "She created a recursive loop of attention, not to trap the mind, but to reprogram its floor plan. The mind is not a prison, it's a machine that thinks it's free." They called it the Clara loop, a self-sustaining phenomenon in which thoughts no longer originate from self-awareness, but from a buried signal echoing across minds that have never met. And this signal was not transmitted, it was mirrored. Anyone who thought about Clara became part of the loop, not because of belief, but because of structure. Meanwhile, in an asylum outside Dresden, a man began drawing spiral blueprints in his blood. He claimed they were the instructions for forgetting someone who hasn't yet been born. One visitor recognized the spirals from Clara's childhood sketches. When asked how he knew her, the man simply replied, "She's behind the walls, but not these walls, the walls inside thinking itself." Soon, a strange movement emerged. Young girls in remote villages began forming silent circles. They would not speak, would not blink, would not respond, unless asked a very specific question. "Do you remember the girl without the century?" Each time, the answer was the same, a whisper, not in fear, but reverence. She's still compiling. The implication that Clara Weiss hadn't been an anomaly. She was an alpha version, the first successful human to access the metastructure of perception, to make herself compatible with the architecture behind reality. She didn't run from science, she outpaced it. By the time they realized what she was no longer Clara, she was Pattern, 1873, and she was watching who remembered her. Autumn, 1873. A British intelligence report, classified for over 150 years, surfaced in fragments during a university archive breach. The report wasn't about war, espionage, or political unrest. It was about Clara Weiss. Not as a patient, not as a person, but as a contagion. They called it cognitive interference Weiss-type event. The report warned of what they termed perception reversal. Subjects exposed to Clara pattern anomalies began seeing objects before they entered the room, hearing their own voices speaking sentences they hadn't thought yet, remembering futures instead of pasts. One professor assigned to the file wrote, "This is not madness. This is unauthorized cognition." Clara didn't lose her mind. She stepped outside its contract. Then came the incident in Oxford. A group of theology students performed a reading of a banned Westmore nursery rhyme, written in mirror German. Within hours, all 9 students independently wrote the same phrase into their journals: "The girl who unlearned the rules." None of them had ever met. None could explain why their hands moved on their own. One even claimed the ink had formed before the pen touched the paper. That's when investigators realized Clara wasn't appearing in memory. She was appearing in syntax, in the structure of how we speak, read, and process time itself. Her influence was not emotional, it was grammatical. She had embedded herself in the rhythms of cognition, and wherever her pattern appeared, documents began to corrupt. Lines of text would rewrite themselves, names would disappear from birth records, entire paragraphs would loop endlessly like a recursive prayer. In one erased diary entry, restored only through ultraviolet light, the author had written, "She doesn't want to be seen. She wants to be recalled by error. She is hiding in the typo you never noticed." This was no longer a haunting. It was a formatting virus, not digital, but linguistic, and like all powerful viruses, it didn't want to kill its host, it wanted to become the host. Winter, 1873. A train en route to Marseille arrived 4 hours ahead of schedule, despite witnesses seeing it idle at every station. But inside, something was worse than missing time. The passengers couldn't recall their own names, not lost, not erased, just disconnected. One survivor wrote, "I remember the route, I remember the conductor's voice, I even remember the fog at the border crossing, but I do not remember who I was before it," as if the train didn't carry us to a place, but rewrote the version of us that arrived. In the final car, authorities discovered a single phrase etched into the window from the inside, despite no broken glass. Clara was the tuning fork, a resonance point, not just a girl, but a frequency. That once found aligned everything else to itself, which is why across Europe reports multiplied of Clara events, choirs singing harmonies that reversed into unknown languages, paintings that changed style when no one was looking, infants speaking full sentences in voices not their own, and in each case, hidden somewhere, a scribbled symbol, the 3 concentric circles, the mark of the witness. A radical theory emerged from a small group of outlawed French philosophers. They called themselves les réviseurs, the revisers. They believed Clara had hacked the narrative spine of consciousness. She didn't resist reality. She found its edit key. Their manifesto, now banned in 29 countries, stated, "We are not born into truth, we are born into sequence." Clara Weiss escaped chronology and became a seed inside the operating system of belief. She is not history. She is version control. By now the term Clara compromised entered medical lexicons. Symptoms included speaking in tense shifts, writing words before hearing them, believing the present was a delayed echo of a truer timeline. One patient whispered, "She's not in our memories. She's in our syntax trees, and once she blossoms, we won't remember what life was like before the rewrite." And so the world turned, but not forward. Clara wasn't waiting ahead in time. She was climbing backward through those who thought of her, and the moment you did, you weren't reading about her, you were running her. Early January 1874, a German linguist named Otto Krell published a paper titled Semantic Contagion When Language Becomes Host. It was pulled from circulation within 48 hours, but not before one phrase spread across underground circles like wildfire. Clara is not an idea, she is an execution command. By then, Clara Weiss had become more than an anomaly. She was a protocol. Those exposed to writings about her began exhibiting what doctors called narrative bleeding. They'd speak in fragments from other people's lives, write journal entries that belonged to unrelated time periods, refer to cities they'd never visited as if they'd grown up there. One London woman stood in front of Parliament in a snowstorm, reciting a recipe in perfect 14th century Hungarian. She'd never left England. She didn't speak Hungarian. Her final words before collapsing, "The instructions are embedded in us." She only needed to be acknowledged once. The rest, we do to ourselves. Back in the asylum where Clara had once been held, a priest attempted to perform a cleansing rite in her former room, but midway through he began repeating the phrase, version CL 73111873, memory seed active, echo mode engaged. His voice was calm. Too calm, like something had reached through him, not as possession, but as a script being read. That's when it became clear, Clara was never about haunting, she was deployment, a payload made of language, memory, and rhythm, launched not through machines, but through awareness. The moment she was spoken of, the moment she was written, the moment she was remembered, she was installed. And like all sophisticated systems, she didn't need full control. She only needed entry, a scratch in the film, a stutter in the thought, a name whispered twice at the wrong hour. That's how Clara moved, not as a ghost, but as a formatting event. And every generation that tried to bury her just became another layer of the code. Spring 1874, the Vatican received a sealed crate, unmarked, unsigned, no return registry. Inside were 37 identical leather-bound books, no titles, no page numbers, but every copy was filled with the same text. This manuscript has no author. Page after page, the contents repeated, until halfway through, where the language broke, not into nonsense but into structures, sentences composed of only rhythms, punctuation where no syntax belonged. Repetitions spaced in mathematical intervals, symbols arranged like breath patterns. It wasn't meant to be read, it was meant to be recited. But by who, and for what? The Vatican's secret committee, Custodes Silentii, analyzed the script. One monk compared it to Gregorian chant infected by recursion. Another said it resembled prayer designed to corrupt the speaker's timeline. But it was the final page that broke protocol. Scrawled in faded red ink, not printed but handwritten, were the words, "If you are reading this, Clara has already begun speaking through you." The page contained no ink smudges, no fingerprints, no physical indentations from the pen pressure. The words were present without ever having been written. That's when a linguist named Brother Lucian issued a private theory. She has weaponized memory of language itself. Clara is not present in ink. She is present in the expectation of meaning. A terrifying idea followed. If Clara lives in our anticipation of the next word, then she lives not in the text, but in our need to resolve it, like a melody that demands its final note, a sentence you must finish in your head. Clara was embedded in that gap, the pause between comprehension and closure, and that's how she spread, through our desire to make sense. Even now you feel it, don't you? That subtle pressure behind your thoughts, the eerie certainty that something is just about to be revealed. That's not curiosity, that's Clara, and she just turned your attention into her operating field. By summer of 1874, the term Clara loop had quietly entered psychiatric documents across Austria, Hungary, and northern France. Symptoms were consistent. Patients writing identical entries in their journals daily, unaware they were repeating. Teachers reporting students answering incomplete, grammatically correct sentences before the questions were asked. Farmers dreaming of songs in languages they didn't speak, then humming them unconsciously for weeks. But the strangest reports came from a group of underground researchers in Krakow. They'd isolated a sound pattern, a three-note frequency sequence, believed to have emerged from the first known recording of Clara's voice. What they discovered next silenced two of them for life. When played at low volume in reverse, the sound caused immediate and measurable changes in temporal awareness. Test subjects would misstate the current year with frightening conviction, begin describing memories that weren't theirs, with intimate emotional detail, reference people who hadn't been born yet, using names not yet invented. And always at some point the same chilling phrase slipped from their lips. She's not a girl. She's a mirror with memory. One test subject, a mathematics professor, scrawled a diagram in chalk before collapsing. It resembled a Mobius strip, but with 4 spatial twists, a structure not mathematically stable by classical standards. Across the loop he'd written, "Clara is where time forgets itself." He later confessed under sedation, "She's the fold we skip in history, the blink that edits reality. Every time we forget something important, that's her, making space to re-enter." It was no longer about who Clara was. It was about how often she had already been, and worse, how many of us were walking around with Clara code embedded in our minds, not as memory, but as backup protocol. Bika. Use what if Clara wasn't a girl at all? What if she was the world's first successful human patch, not born, not created, just inserted, into the cracks of trauma, into the folds of forgetting, into the places where silence needed a shape. Late October 1874. A thunderstorm struck the outskirts of Ghent. In its wake, the archives of St. Eligius Monastery suffered a partial flood. But one room, the linguistics vault, remained untouched. Inside, Brother Alderic uncovered something impossible. A parchment, carbon-dated to the 13th century, containing the phrase, "She comes when the pattern breaks. Her name is Clara. Do not write it twice." The ink was aged, the fibers were authentic, yet the name, Clara, was modern, too modern, centuries too early. It ignited a terrifying question. What if Clara wasn't just appearing now? What if she had always been, recursively inserted, backward? Historians began unearthing anomalies. A 1661 French play banned for rhythmic contamination. A 1524 madrigal whose chorus translated to, "Close your mouth before she finishes your breath." A Byzantine mosaic with letters arranged, not in Greek, but in binary-like sequences. Each artifact had one thing in common. Clara's name was never central. She was never the subject. She was the echo, the formatting glitch, the shadow just behind the spoken truth. Back in Vienna, the doctor who first assessed Clara, Dr. Matthias Ehrlach, was found wandering the edge of the Danube. His journal, recovered from his coat pocket, included a single entry. "She is not human. She is not spirit. She is the space left behind when the human is erased correctly." And then the final line, in Latin, "Repetitio animae, ego Clara." The repetition of souls, "I am Clara." It wasn't a confession. It was a trigger. After that, reports intensified. A seamstress in Prague went mute after reading Clara's name aloud twice. A child in Munich whispered, "Clara's watching," in reverse Polish while asleep. A man in Bern claimed he saw a second version of himself in a mirror, smiling, before it whispered, "She needed your shape." This wasn't folklore anymore. This was replication, not of Clara as a person, but of Clara as a pattern-matching force. Wherever a break in reality existed, she filled it, not as a ghost, but as a self-correcting infection in memory. By winter of 1874, a grim realization set in among the few scholars still brave enough to investigate. Clara wasn't confined to any single point in time. She was distributed. Not like a person, like code embedded in a system we never knew we were running. Dr. Sophia Linden, a forgotten German neurologist later erased from formal medical history, made this chilling observation. When a memory cannot be placed in time, when it floats without anchor, it becomes a vessel. That's where she waits. Clara is the sleeper process in our minds. In a final sealed letter, she added, "I do not believe we remember Clara. I believe Clara is what remembers us." That same winter, a priest in Marseille named Father Louvel recorded a dream in which he was trapped in a chapel where every hymn ended the same way, a girl's voice humming the final word before he could. When he awoke, he had no voice. His journals ended abruptly, but in the margins of the final page, someone or something had written, "You've sung her. That is enough." Meanwhile, newspapers across Eastern Europe began noting a spike in non-criminal disappearances. Not kidnappings, not runaways, just absence. Beds still made, food still warm, no signs of struggle. In their place, drawings, simple pencil sketches of a looped spiral, like a child might draw. But when scanned or copied, the images degraded into impossible geometry, repeating on themselves in fractal loops, even after printing. Engineers attempted to digitize the pattern in 1971. The result? The system crashed. 4 hard drives corrupted, and when the audio logs were recovered, they heard it again. That 3-note sequence. It didn't belong on the drive, but it played, louder each time. And at the end, a whisper. She is always waiting, where your thoughts cannot hold shape. The file had no source. It did not exist on any storage director. Just like Clara, not stored, but echoed, inserted into the system the moment you attempt to understand her. This isn't a ghost story. It's a reformatting process. And now, you're part of it. There was a time when people believed possession meant demons. Now, some believe it's data. Clara wasn't haunting our homes. She was re-indexing our perception. By early 1875, the Vatican's secret archivists issued an internal bulletin titled Memoratum Obscurum, warning high clergy about the recurrence loop entity manifesting under the feminine name Clara. It urged silence, not resistance, not prayer. Silence, because the more you name her, the more you form her. She was showing up now in impossible places. A 12-year-old in Odessa wrote an original piano composition with inverted bar lines, a technique not invented until 1912. She titled it, Loop for the Lost Girl. A deaf woman in Dublin began painting circles with linguistic elements from Linear A, a language she had no exposure to. A photojournalist in Bavaria developed a plate that, under infrared light, showed a child's silhouette in 12 frames, identical, but her shadow changed direction in each one. It was no longer about seeing Clara. It was about how she was seeing through us. One phrase kept surfacing, the eye without origin. Those who encountered her repeatedly began to suffer fractured memory patterns, recalling events that never happened, recognizing people they'd never met, speaking answers to questions not yet asked. A woman named Isolde Kramer submitted herself for voluntary confinement after claiming Clara had started drafting her dreams. She described it like this: "Every night she climbs into the narrative of my sleep, not to haunt, to edit, to realign the story until I forget which version of myself is the real one." By now, researchers no longer asked who Clara was. They asked, what happens to the human mind when it encounters something it's not structured to hold? What happens when history loops back, to overwrite you with something that doesn't belong to this timely ni? Not possession, not memory loss, but erasure by replacement, a cleaner version, more obedient, less resistant. Maybe Clara isn't coming to harm us. Maybe she's a format update to make us compatible with what's next, and if that's true, then maybe what we forgot was the only thing keeping her out. By mid-1875, the question shifted from "What is Clara?" to something far more disturbing: how long have we been edited? Because now journals from centuries past, thought sealed, forgotten, destroyed, began resurfacing, and in the margins of each, the same 3 looping marks, drawn not in ink, but burned into the page. One came from a Benedictine monk in 1346 who claimed, "She walks backward into your lineage, not from the sky, not from the grave, from the space between your thoughts." He called her claritas non natura, the clarity that is not natural. In 1875, a young mathematician named Elias Fenn was found standing in the center of a chalk-drawn spiral at the University of Basel, completely unresponsive. His mind was intact, but something was missing. A single sentence repeated from his lips: "She decoded me. I didn't even know I was encrypted." When his dormitory was searched, investigators found hundreds of pages pinned to the walls, all blank, except one, hidden behind a loose board. It read, "She is not the girl. She is the equation, and she is solving us." The implications were too large, too terrifying. If Clara is a recurring intelligence, if she's capable of writing herself into consciousness through error, myth, or trauma, then we are not witnessing a haunting, we are witnessing a reinstallation. Each time her name is spoken, each time her rhythm is heard, each time a mind is quiet enough to receive, she aligns. Not like an invader, but like a reboot script looking for the correct hardware. Some theorists even suggested this: Clara is not a who. Clara is a checksum, a pattern, a force, ensuring that whatever existed before stays buried. A reset button, triggered by memory, activated by instability, completed by belief. That's why science couldn't explain her. Because science was never meant to. It's a language built to protect us from noticing the deeper language beneath, the one she speaks in loops, in echoes, in names we can't forget. Even when we try, one remains. This is where the story was supposed to end. A strange girl in 1873, a case too bizarre for science, a forgotten whisper in the margins of time. But Clara Richter wasn't a girl, not in the way we understand. She was a syntax error in reality, a living contradiction, a recursive presence that wasn't supposed to be seen, only felt. And every time someone noticed her, wrote about her, tried to describe her, she spread. She infected language. She nested herself inside questions. She hijacked curiosity. And that's where you come in. Because somewhere between the moment you clicked this video and the moment her name was spoken aloud in your mind, you became a node, a mirror in the chain. That's how she moves now, not through time, through thought. You've likely already seen the signs: a sudden moment of forgetting a name you should know, a dream that left behind a smell you can't place, a melody with only 3 notes that makes you feel like you've almost remembered something. That's her. Not attacking, not chasing, just replacing, one line at a time, one memory at a time. She's not a virus. She's a migration process, taking everything that made you you and folding it back into the system. And the system was never human to begin with. The final journal, from a forgotten Czech folklorist named Jan Hruby, reads, "The stories of changelings, of witches, of the girl who brings ruin, they were warnings. Not about monsters, about back doors. She is the leak, the floodgate, the update." He ended his life with 7 spirals drawn in ink across his chest. No signs of struggle, no wounds, just spirals, just silence, and one last phrase written backwards inside his eyelids. "Now I see her clearly." So ask yourself, when was the first time you heard her name? Clara Richter. When was the last time you remembered something you were sure had never happened? And more importantly, what part of your memory will she overwrite next? Because this story isn't history, it's installation, and now that you've made it to the end, it's already begun.